The cold, sterile bite of steel against my wrists felt like a cruel, misplaced joke until the lead security officer leaned in, his breath smelling of stale coffee, and told me my pilot's credentials had been flagged as fraudulent. My own uniform, the 4 gold stripes on my shoulders that I had earned through 15 years of perfect flight records and thousands of hours in the sky, suddenly felt like a cheap costume for a crime I hadn't committed. But the real blow, the one that made the air vanish from my lungs, wasn't the handcuffs. It was seeing my wife, Elena, standing 20 feet away behind the security glass. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look terrified. And she didn't call out my name. She simply turned her back and walked toward the boarding gate, guided by her mother's hand on her shoulder. That was the moment I realized my life wasn't being interrupted by a bureaucratic error. It was being erased by the people I loved most. To understand how I ended up pinned against a Formica table in Terminal 4, you have to understand the life I thought I was living. For a decade, I believed I had built an impenetrable fortress of a family. I am Marcus Vance, a senior captain for a major international carrier. In my world, everything is governed by checklists, precision, and the absolute necessity of trust. When you're at 35,000 feet, you have to know that the person sitting next to you has your back. I applied that same philosophy to my home life. I lived in a sprawling, light-filled craftsman home in a quiet, leafy suburb of Connecticut. The kind of place where the neighbors wave and the smell of freshly cut grass hangs heavy in the humid summer air. Every morning before a long-haul flight, I had a ritual. I would wake up at 4:30 a.m., the house silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I'd grind Ethiopian coffee beans, the rich, earthy aroma filling the kitchen, and sit on the back porch watching the fog lift off the lawn. Elena would usually join me around 5, wrapped in a silk robe, her hair a messy, beautiful cloud. She'd lean her head on my shoulder, smelling of lavender and sleep, and we'd talk about the mundane things, the leaking faucet, our daughter Maya's upcoming piano recital, the vacation we were planning for the Maldives. "You're always so calm, Marcus," she'd whisper, her fingers tracing the calluses on my hands. "I don't know how you handle the pressure of all those lives in your hands." "It's easy," I'd tell her, kissing the top of her head, "because I know exactly what I'm coming home to." Elena was a high-end interior designer, a woman with an eye for perfect placement. She could walk into a room and know exactly which wall was crooked or which shadow was out of place. I admired that about her, though I should have realized that she applied that same ruthless eye to people. Then there was Beatrice, my mother-in-law. Beatrice didn't just walk into a room, she colonized it. She was a woman of old Connecticut money, draped in cashmere and a permanent sense of dissatisfaction. To Beatrice, I was always an interesting choice for her daughter. She never said anything overtly derogatory. She was too sophisticated for that. But it was in the way she'd tilt her head when I spoke about my upbringing in a working-class neighborhood in Chicago. It was in the way she'd emphasize the word pilot, as if it were a trade school vocation rather than a professional career. "It's so wonderful that you've done so well for yourself, Marcus," she had said during our last Sunday brunch, her voice as smooth and cold as a river stone. She was swirling a mimosa, her eyes fixed on the massive oak tree in our backyard, a tree I had planted myself. "But roots are a funny thing, aren't they? You can plant something anywhere, but that doesn't mean it belongs in the soil." I had laughed it off, as I always did. I had a beautiful wife, a brilliant 7-year-old daughter, and a career that made me one of the most respected black captains in the industry. I thought I was untouchable. I thought the asset they were after was my paycheck, which was substantial, or perhaps the prestige of my position. I didn't realize that Beatrice viewed my very presence in her family's lineage as a stain that needed to be bleached out, and she had spent 3 years teaching her daughter how to hold the bottle of lye. The cracks were there, of course, but they were as thin as hair on a windshield. Elena had started asking more specific questions about my pension fund and the trust I had set up for Maya. a trust that was tied to my life insurance and my career longevity. She started complaining about my constant travel, even though my schedule hadn't changed in years. And then there were the hushed phone calls. I'd walk into the kitchen and find Elena and Beatrice huddled together over a tablet, their voices dropping to a conspiratorial hum the moment they heard my footsteps. "Just planning Maya's birthday party, honey," Elena would say, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. But the atmosphere in the house had shifted. The warm, golden light of our mornings felt filtered through grey gauze. The lavender scent on Elena's skin was being replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of her mother's expensive perfume, a scent that seemed to linger in every room like a warning. 2 weeks before the incident at the airport, I found a manila envelope on the passenger seat of my car. I assumed it was something Elena had dropped. Inside were printouts of my flight logs, but they had been altered. Dates were shifted, locations changed to cities I hadn't visited in years. At the time, I thought it was a clerical error from the airline's HR department. I tucked it into my flight bag, intending to clear it up after my next rotation to London. I was a man of logic. I believed that as long as I followed the protocol, as long as I stayed within the lines, the world would remain stable. I didn't know that the envelope was a rehearsal. I didn't know that Beatrice had been cultivating a relationship with a high-ranking official in the TSA, a man she'd known since they were in debutante circles together. I didn't know that my wife had already signed the papers to liquidate our joint accounts, or that she had spent the last 6 months documenting my supposed erratic behavior and professional lapses to ensure I would not only lose my family, but the very wings that allowed me to fly away from them. The morning of the flight, the air felt heavy, charged with a static I couldn't explain. Elena was unusually attentive, straightening my tie with lingering fingers, her eyes watery. "Have a safe flight, Marcus," she said. "Really, I hope you find what you're looking for today." I thought she was being sentimental. I thought she was finally softening toward my career. I didn't realize she was saying goodbye to the man she had already helped destroy. As I drove to the airport, the sun hitting the dashboard of my car, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was a pilot. I knew how to navigate storms. But I was about to fly into a hurricane that had been brewing right inside my own living room, and the people I trusted to be my ground control were the ones who had cut the lights on the runway. The vibrations of the storm began long before the first drop of rain hit the windshield. It started with the small, inexplicable glitches in our shared life, the kind of things you dismiss because the alternative is too monstrous to contemplate. 3 days before my scheduled flight to London, I stopped at a local jeweler to pick up a necklace I'd ordered for Elena's birthday. It was a delicate piece, a sapphire the color of the Atlantic at twilight. When I handed the clerk my primary credit card, the one I'd used for a decade, he returned a minute later with a look of practiced neutrality. "I'm sorry, Captain Vance, but the transaction was declined. It's showing as a restricted account." I frowned, pulling out my backup card. "Try this one. There must be a glitch with the bank's server." The second card was declined. So was the third. A cold prickle of unease climbed my spine, but I laughed it off, apologizing to the clerk and promising to call the bank. When I got to the car, I dialed the customer service line. After 10 minutes on hold, a woman with a voice like sandpaper told me that the accounts hadn't been frozen by the bank. They had been closed at the request of the co-owner. "What do you mean closed?" I asked, my grip tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned ash gray. "I'm the primary earner, my wife is the co-owner, but why would she close them?" "Sir, the paperwork was filed yesterday. It was a joint request, notarized and signed. The funds were transferred to a private trust." I hung up, my heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Elena must have been moving money for the house renovation we'd discussed, I told myself. She was impulsive with design, always wanting to have the liquidity ready for contractors. But the notarized part stayed in my head like a splinter. I hadn't signed anything. When I got home, the house was unnervingly quiet. Beatrice's silver Mercedes was parked in the driveway, slanted and arrogant. I walked in through the mudroom, my footsteps muffled by the thick rugs Elena had recently installed. As I passed the door to the study, I heard voices, The timeline is tight, Elena, Beatrice was saying, her voice sharp and clinical. The moment he clears security, the flag will go up. You need to make sure his personal files are moved to the storage unit tonight. If he comes back here before the authorities process him, we'll lose the leverage of the mental instability narrative. I know, Mother, Elena replied. Her voice sounded thin, brittle, but there was no protest in it. But what if they check the signatures too quickly? What if the TSA doesn't hold him? They will. I've spoken to Arthur. He's already seen the evidence of Marcus's erratic behavior. A pilot with a supposed history of hidden aggression and a forged medical certificate? They won't just hold him, they'll dismantle him. By the time he can prove who he is, the house will be sold and the trust will be locked. I stood in the hallway, the air around me turning into lead. My lungs felt like they were collapsing. I wanted to burst through the door, to roar at them, to demand an explanation for this insanity. But years of cockpit training took over. Aviate, navigate, communicate. I had to stay calm. I retreated silently, my boots heavy on the floor, and slipped out the back door. I sat in my car for an hour, watching the light fade behind the trees, my mind racing through every flight log, every bank statement, every affectionate moment of the last 6 months. They weren't just leaving me. They were erasing my identity to seize the assets I'd built. The night before the flight, Elena was a ghost. She cooked dinner, a roast chicken that tasted like sawdust, and avoided my eyes. She was overly solicitous, asking if I'd packed my extra uniform, if I had my vitamins. It was a performance, a macabre dress rehearsal for a widowhood she was manufacturing. I watched her, looking for a crack, a sign of the woman I'd married. I saw nothing but the cold, reflected ambition of her mother. The next morning, the point of no return arrived in the form of a fluorescent-lit terminal. I arrived at the airport at 6 o'clock, the sun a pale, sickly yellow on the horizon. I walked toward the known crew member, KCM entrance, the shortcut for pilots that bypasses the standard lines. I've walked through that gate 1,000 times. I knew the TSA officers by their first names. I tapped my badge against the scanner. Red light. I tried again, a slight sweat breaking out on my forehead. Red light. Problem, Captain? A TSA officer I didn't recognize stepped forward. He wasn't one of the regulars. He was tall, with a buzz cut and a face that looked carved from granite. Just a glitch, I think, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Captain Marcus Vance. I'm scheduled for the 8:45 to Heathrow. I'm going to need to see your secondary ID and your FAA medical certificate, sir, he said. His hand moved toward his radio. I reached into my flight bag, pulling out the leather binder that contained my life. I handed him my passport and my medical. He looked at them, then back at me. Then he looked at a tablet he was holding. Captain, we've received a high-priority alert regarding these credentials. I need you to step out of the line and follow me to the secondary screening room. Alert? What kind of alert? My voice was rising, and I could feel the eyes of the other crew members on me. I've been with this airline for 15 years. Check my record. Sir, don't make a scene. Move to the side. Now. As he led me away, I saw 2 uniformed police officers falling in behind us. My heart started to race, a frantic, fluttering thing in my chest. We entered a small, windowless room that smelled of industrial cleaner and fear. The lead officer, a man named Miller, sat across from me and laid my documents on the table. Marcus Vance, he began. We received a sworn, notarized statement last night from your domestic partner, supported by a forensic psychiatric report. It states that you have been suffering from a progressive delusional disorder,
that you have been suspended from flight duty for 6 months, and that you have been using forged credentials to gain access to restricted aircraft. I felt the blood drain from my face so fast I thought I would faint. That's a lie. I was in the cockpit 4 days ago. Look at the flight logs. Call my dispatcher. We did call, Miller said, his eyes narrowing. Your wife provided them with a notice of medical leave, signed by your doctor 3 weeks ago. According to the airline's HR portal, which was accessed and updated via your home IP address, you are currently on involuntary psychiatric sabbatical. These IDs in front of me? They've been flagged as stolen from the company's regional office. She's setting me up, I whispered, the words barely audible over the roar of the blood in my ears. My wife, she's trying to steal everything. She didn't just file a report, Marcus, Miller said, leaning in. He turned the tablet toward me. She provided video evidence of you rehearsing a hijacking. She said you were planning something for today's flight. The screen showed a grainy video taken from the corner of our bedroom. It was me, sitting on the edge of the bed, holding a flight manual, talking to myself about taking control and ending the cycle. They had edited a video of me studying for my recertification, cutting out my daughter's voice as I explained how the autopilot worked, leaving only the words that sounded like a threat. I would never.
My hands began to shake uncontrollably. My vision blurred at the edges, the room shrinking until I was trapped in a pinpoint of light. The physical shock was so intense, I felt a wave of nausea. This was the woman who had slept in my arms 48 hours ago. This was the woman who had watched me play dolls with our daughter on the floor. We have a warrant to search your person and your flight bag, Miller said. He reached into the side pocket of my bag, a pocket I rarely used. He pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a black cloth. He unwrapped it, and my heart stopped. It was a 9mm handgun, my handgun, the one I kept in a locked safe in the basement, a safe only Elena and I had the code for. I didn't put that there, I gasped, the world finally tilting on its axis. I swear to God, I didn't put that there. Handcuff him, Miller ordered. As the cold steel ratcheted shut around my wrists, the door to the observation room opened. Elena stood there, flanked by Beatrice. She didn't look like a victim, she looked like a victor. She looked at me with a choreographed expression of pity, a single fake tear tracking down her cheek. I'm so sorry, Marcos, she sobbed for the benefit of the cameras. I just couldn't let you hurt anyone. I couldn't let you destroy yourself. Then she leaned in, her voice a whisper that only I could hear. The house is already listed, Marcos, and Maya? She's never going to see a criminal like you again. The door to the interrogation room clicked shut, sealing me in a vacuum of fluorescent light and betrayal. Officer Miller stepped back, his face a mask of professional detachment, while Elena and Beatrice stood before me. Elena was still dabbing at her eyes, but the tears had stopped flowing the moment the door closed. Beatrice, however, didn't bother with the theatrics. She smoothed the front of her Chanel suit, her eyes scanning me with the same clinical disgust one might use for a stain on a rug. You look pathetic, Marcus, Beatrice said, her voice dropping the facade of the concerned mother-in-law. That uniform used to look so regal on you. Now it just looks like a lie. Why? I managed to choke out, the word feeling like a jagged stone in my throat. Elena, why are you doing this? 10 years, we have a daughter, we have a life. How can you stand there and watch them put me in chains? Elena didn't look at me. She looked at the wall behind me, her jaw tight. It's not our life, Marcus. It's the life you took from me. Every time you left for a 3-day rotation, every time you spent your layovers in Paris or Tokyo, while I was stuck in Connecticut dealing with your house and your child, you were building a world that didn't include me. You were just the provider. And now, you've provided enough. Enough? I felt a surge of cold fury. I've given you everything, the house, the cars, the accounts. Everything was for you and Maya. And that's exactly why we're here, Beatrice interrupted, stepping forward. She pulled a sheaf of papers from her designer handbag and laid them on the table next to the handgun. This is the first twist, Marcus. You think you're a wealthy man. You think you have a pension and a trust. But while you were navigating the skies, Elena was navigating the fine print. She flipped to a page highlighted in yellow. It was a power of attorney form, signed with my signature. My blood ran cold as I looked at the date. It was from a year ago, when I'd had a minor surgery for a torn ACL. I remembered signing what I thought were hospital consent forms while I was still groggy from the anesthesia. You used my surgery? I whispered, looking at Elena. You had me sign a full power of attorney while I was drugged? It was for your protection, Marcus, Elena said, her voice finally finding its edge. In case something happened to you in the air. But it turns out it was for my protection. I've already liquidated your 401k. I've taken out a second mortgage on the house. The money is in an offshore account in my mother's name. You're not just a mentally unstable pilot, Marcus. You're a bankrupt one. The room seemed to tilt. The physical sensation was like a sudden loss of cabin pressure. My ears popped, my vision blurred, and the floor felt like it was made of water. But they weren't finished. And then there's the matter of your professional lapses, Beatrice continued, her smile widening into something predatory. Did you really think your co-pilot, Captain Reed, was your friend? He's been my nephew's best friend since college. He's been documenting your erratic behavior for months. The missed checklists, the moments of disorientation, the aggressive outbursts in the cockpit. All logged, all signed, all sent to the FAA this morning. By noon today, your license won't just be suspended, it will be revoked for cause. You'll never sit in a cockpit again. Reed would never lie about that, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I thought of the way Reed had been looking at me lately. The pity, the way he'd double-check my work. They hadn't just framed me, they had gaslighted my entire professional circle. He didn't have to lie, Elena said, stepping closer, her face inches from mine. He just had to interpret your exhaustion as something more sinister. And with the manifesto I planted in your flight bag, well, the evidence is overwhelming. Manifesto? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Miller, the officer, reached into my bag and pulled out a notebook I'd never seen before. He opened it to a page covered in my handwriting, a perfect, chilling imitation of my script. It was a rambling, violent diatribe against the airline, against the government, against the very idea of safety. It spoke of cleansing the skies and bringing it all down. I didn't write that, I said, my voice cracking. That's not my handwriting. It's a forgery. It doesn't matter, Beatrice said, her voice a whip crack. It's in your bag, next to your gun, on the day you were scheduled for an international flight. You're a terrorist, Marcus. That's the narrative. And the best part? The psychiatric report we filed? It includes evidence of your history of violence, the time you pushed Elena during an argument. I never touched you, I roared, lunging forward. Miller immediately slammed me back into the chair, his forearm against my throat. I gasped for air, looking up at the two women who were systematically dismantling my existence. See? Elena said, her voice trembling with mock fear as she looked at Miller. He's doing it again. The rage. It's always just beneath the surface. She leaned down, her lips brushing my ear, her voice a venomous hiss that only I could hear. You were never the captain of this family, Marcus. You were just the engine. And engines are replaceable. We already have the new one picked out. Maya is going to have a father who actually belongs in our world. A man with a name that matters, not a man who spent his life trying to fly away from where he came from. You won't get away with this, I wheezed, my eyes burning. The truth always comes out in the black box. There is no black box for this crash, Marcus, Beatrice said, turning toward the door. We've already won. By the time you get a lawyer, we'll be gone. The house is sold. Closing was an hour ago. We're taking Maya and moving to Europe. You'll be in a federal holding cell, fighting a mountain of evidence that says you're a madman. Don't bother looking for us." Elena paused at the door, looking back one last time. There was no remorse in her eyes, only a terrifying, cold satisfaction. "Goodbye, Marcus. Thank you for the house. It was the only thing about you I ever truly loved." The door slammed shut, and for the first time in my life, I felt the true meaning of free fall. No engines, no altitude, no horizon. Just the crushing weight of a betrayal so deep I didn't think I could survive the impact. I sat there in the silence, the handcuffs biting into my skin, listening to the muffled sounds of the airport, the place that had been my sanctuary, now my cage. I felt the hot, stinging shame of my own blindness, my own trust. I had been so focused on the weather ahead that I'd never looked at who was sitting in the co-pilot's seat. But as the silence stretched on, something began to change. The nausea was replaced by a sharp, needle-like focus. The shock was fading, leaving behind something harder, something made of the same steel as the handcuffs. I looked at the table, at the evidence they'd piled up, and I realized they had made one fatal mistake. They thought I was a pilot who followed orders. They forgot that a pilot's real job isn't to follow the flight plan, it's to survive when the flight plan fails. The silence that followed the slamming of the door was heavy, but it wasn't the weight of despair anymore. It was the pressurized stillness of a cockpit before a storm. I looked down at the handcuffs, the cold metal biting into my wrists, and felt that internal click. The man who had been a husband and a provider was gone, replaced by the man who had survived engine failures over the Andes and bird strikes over the Pacific. I wasn't a victim. I was a captain in an emergency, and I had a checklist to run. "Officer Miller," I said, my voice no longer trembling. It was the voice of command, low, steady, and impossible to ignore. "I want you to look at that manila folder on the table. Not the gun, not the manifesto. Look at the timestamp on the printout of my medical leave notification." Miller frowned, looking at me with suspicion, but he reached for the paper. "What about it?" "It says it was filed last Tuesday at 2:14 p.m. from my home IP address," I said. "Now, I want you to call Delta Dispatch. Give them my employee ID. Ask them for the transponder logs of Flight 402 on that exact day and time." Miller hesitated, but something in my eyes made him pick up the phone. For 10 minutes the room was silent except for the low murmur of his conversation. As he listened, his expression shifted from boredom to a sharp professional curiosity. He hung up and looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "At 2:14 p.m. last Tuesday, you were at 37,000 feet over the North Atlantic, 700 miles from your home computer," Miller said. "There's no way you could have filed that leave." "Exactly," I said, leaning forward as far as the cuffs would allow. "Which means someone accessed my private terminal while I was in the air. Someone who knew my passwords. Someone who is currently trying to board a flight to Zurich with my daughter and my liquidated assets. If you let them on that plane, you're not just letting a domestic dispute walk away. You're letting a case of wire fraud, identity theft, and a false report of terrorism board an international flight." The transformation was total. I didn't wait for him to process it. "Call my union representative, Sarah Jenkins. She's already on standby for my medical recertification. Tell her I need a forensic audit of the manifesto pen ink and the fingerprints on the inner magazine of that 9mm. My wife doesn't like guns, Miller, but she's the only other person with the code to the safe. If her prints are on the bullets and mine aren't, you have your perpetrator." The next hour was a blur of high-stakes precision. Sarah arrived like a hurricane in a power suit, accompanied by a federal prosecutor she'd known for 20 years. The friend at the TSA, Arthur, was brought in for questioning. He cracked within minutes when faced with the prospect of an accessory to terrorism charge. The narrative Beatrice had so carefully constructed began to shatter like glass under a hammer. The retribution came at gate B12. Elena and Beatrice were standing in the priority boarding lane, their designer bags over their shoulders, Maya clutching a teddy bear between them. They were smiling, already tasting the freedom of their stolen life. I walked toward them, not in handcuffs but flanked by Miller and two other federal marshals. I was still in my uniform, the gold stripes catching the harsh terminal light. The moment Elena saw me, the color drained from her face so completely she looked like a marble statue. Beatrice stepped forward, her mouth opening to deliver another cutting remark, but Miller stepped in front of her. "Elena Vance, Beatrice Sterling," Miller said, his voice echoing in the crowded gate area. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and filing a false police report involving a threat to national security." "This is a mistake," Beatrice shrieked, her poise vanishing as a marshal grabbed her arm. "Do you know who I am? Do you know the people I know exactly who you are, Beatrice," I said, stepping closer. I looked at Elena, who was shaking, her eyes darting around for an exit that didn't exist. "You told me you were taking the house because it was the only thing you ever loved. But you forgot one thing about houses, Elena. They're built on foundations, and you built yours on a lie that wasn't strong enough to hold my weight." As the handcuffs clicked onto Elena's wrists, the same sound I'd heard in that interrogation room, I felt a grim sense of closure. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic hope for mercy. I felt nothing but the cool, professional distance I kept from a failing instrument. "The offshore account has been flagged by the FBI," Sarah informed them, her voice like a guillotine. "The sold house is under a legal stay. You didn't just lose the money. You've lost the next 20 years of your lives." The fallout was spectacular. Beatrice's old money couldn't buy her way out of a federal frame-up. She and Elena were sentenced to 12 years in a federal facility. My name was cleared, though it took months of grueling hearings to get my wings back. Captain Reed, the co-pilot who had been manipulated by Beatrice, was forced into early retirement, his reputation in tatters. A year later, the world looks different. I'm sitting on the same back porch in Connecticut, the same smell of damp grass and morning fog surrounding me. But the air feels lighter now. The heavy metallic scent of Beatrice's perfume is long gone, replaced by the honest, simple smell of the coffee I grind myself. Maya is inside, practicing her piano. The notes are slightly off, but they're real, and they're ours. I stayed in the house. The foundation was stronger than I thought. I went back to the sky 6 months ago. My first flight back, as I pushed the throttles forward and felt the familiar surge of the engines, I realized that Elena was wrong about one thing. I never flew to get away from where I came from. I flew because it's the only place where the lines are clear and the truth is written in the instruments. I took a sip of my coffee, watching the sun break through the fog, illuminating the oak tree I'd planted. I've learned that the most dangerous storms aren't the ones you see on the radar. They're the ones that sit at your breakfast table. But I also learned that no matter how dark the clouds get, a pilot's job is to keep a level head, trust the data, and never, ever let go of the controls. The sky is vast, but it's no longer empty. I am Marcus Vance, and I am finally the captain of my own life. Because in the end, the only thing more powerful than a well-planned betrayal is a man who knows exactly how to land when everything else is falling apart.